Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I want to share a paper with you, Radical Embodied Relation at Any Scale, from Remembering to Navigating. My name is Andrea Hiott, and this is for the Active Inference Institute Symposium for 2025. So this is a bit of a radical embodied understanding of mind, and it works at any scale, as the paper says. So it's supposed to expand some of our fundamental assumptions about brains, memories, minds, and bodily movement and how all those relate. So the title of this talk is Kaleidoscopic Cognition, How the Brain Can Be Modeled and Use Modeling Without Having a Model. I know that sounds paradoxical, and if you know me, you know I like paradoxes. Holding paradox is sort of the point of a lot of this work, but that title might seem impossible, actually. So how can the brain model without having models? And how can we use representations without them being stored somewhere? These questions have been really important in neuroscience and philosophy. Some might even say they've been plaguing neuroscience and philosophy of mind lately. Like we just can't move past them. But there's recent research on the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that I studied. It's a little seahorse-shaped structure on both sides of your head in both lobes, and it's forcing us to rethink some basic assumptions about a lot of these words that I've already mentioned. So what we're discovering is that the brain, or I would rather actually talk about the central nervous system and the bodily sensory movement of it all, but let's just say the brain, doesn't work like a computer with shared, stored files. Instead, it operates more like a kaleidoscope. And I know that might sound crazy, but actually, it's a very helpful, strange new vision that we kind of need right now. And that it feels strange is probably a good thing. So it's this idea of creating shifting patterns through different but direct refraction of experience. So if you think of the encounter and then the body and then whatever that encounter is becoming as part of the body and sort of going back into the encounter as, then you can think of it more as something prismatic or kaleidoscopic. So this framework is coming from neuroscience, at least as I read certain studies and as I've been part of certain areas of that field, and especially grid cells, place cells, these kinds of things, which are in the hippocampus. And I think it has profound implications for how we understand these words that we've been taking for granted, like memory, thinking, but also navigation and everything that we've ever thought about as cognition, not only in humans, but when we try to understand this activity that unites us across different life forms. I'm going to be talking about the hippocampus as a kaleidoscopic function, a way of trying to visualize some of this new research, which is moving us beyond either or patterns that we assume and that I think we're all sort of stuck in at the moment in brain research, even though we say we're not. But I want to push us a little bit towards this kaleidoscopic or prismatic idea of cognition. And hopefully that'll help us move beyond these representation wars and ways of talking that have sort of paralyzed us in cognitive science. The idea is to synthesize insights from 4 key papers that, when read together, will reveal something pretty extraordinary about cognition. And so these are the 4 papers. And the first one is my paper, the one that's kind of framing this, and I guess the sort of foundational text for it. And in there, I argue that recent hippocampal research forces us or allows us to reconceive what a neural representation is and to think of it as a communicative assessment, rather than something stored or findable or some sort of hieroglyph in the brain. And I introduced the concept of waymaking, which is just a way of talking about this process that we call cognition or this process that we call locomotion, but on the same track. There's also a brand new Nature neuroscience paper by Penn and colleagues, which came out around the same time, which talks about, well, it's called path integration in the hippocampus by shifting reference frames. And I really see this as just crucial empirical work and just great timing that it comes out now, because it has a lot to do with what I'm trying to discuss here. And it's showing us that grid cells don't maintain stable patterns, but are constantly shifting between reference frames, even though there is a stability. So there's a paradox built into this, but it gives us a good way to understand this notion of kaleidoscopic modeling that I'm trying to introduce here. And then we have the Lenz and Clark and Friston paper from 2017. Sorry if I said somebody's name wrong there. the active inference approach to ecological perception, because I think there's a lot of ideas in there that fit very well with this. And also just the mathematical and theoretical framework needs to be built up for how we might do this. And I think active inference is probably, and especially also Bayesian ideas in machine learning and so on, have already started figuring out ways to maybe think about layered mathematics in the way that I'm talking about here. But also just the ecological side of it is very fitting, that organisms engage in modeling behaviors without storing models. And of course, sometimes we slip up and say models are in the brain, but if you really look at what is actually being said, it's not that the models are in the brain stored somewhere, it's that the whole body is modeling. This last paper too, which inspired my first paper, and it's from Jacob Belmond and the Doller Lab, which is where I worked at the Max Planck Institute. It's called Navigating Cognition, Spatial Codes for Human Thinking. And it shows us that the mechanics we use for physical navigation are the same ones we use for abstract thought, even though thinking and geographical navigating can't be resolved as like the same thing. We can use the same metrics to understand them, but those metrics cannot be based on these either assumptions that, like we've been sort of using, whether it's like global and local or even mental and physical, like conceptual space, physical space, memory, navigation. Those ways of talking and our use of the word representation as we're talking about them in cognitive neuroscience has to shift. So all these papers together point towards a unified understanding of cognition as kaleidoscopic, or at least as constellatory is another word I use, demanding we find ways to model it kaleidoscopically rather than binary, and these binary assumptions that frame so much of the way we talk about all of these topics, the way we even use the words, and the way we model them, even if we don't realize that's happening. So by introducing this kaleidoscopic cognition, I'm trying to push us a bit into a dynamic, immediate, irreducible understanding of what we mean by representation, which is actually a communication. So we also understand that we're going to do this through communicating about the patterns of regularity, and that this communication isn't findable, but it is representational. So that's a little tricky. This holding paradox idea is really good, and also this kaleidoscope where you have similar patterns, but based on the input of the light, you can even think of it as prismatic, I guess. You're going to get different results, but those will all be tied to similar patterns. So again, I've mentioned paradox quite a few times, and the main paradox is that motivates this framework is representations without representations, models without models, or modeling without models, or representing without representations, maybe is a better way to say it. But traditional neuroscience always assumes that cognition requires stored models, internal representations that the brain builds and maintains. So when you remember something from your childhood home, there must be some neural structure that is appearing in your brain that represents that home, right? So when you navigate through a city, you have some kind of map in your head. This is just the way we talk about it. Most people, of course, don't actually think you can, pull a little map out of your brain or actually find some kind of structure in the brain that's going to represent home in some kind of one-to-one way. However, we still talk about it that way in our papers, and we still assume this language. So the reality is that organisms are navigating these complex environments without anything that looks like explicit stored representations. And in fact, there's so much going on all the time that any of our actual experiments is just looking at a tiny bit of it. So if we find some brain activity that corresponds with a particular memory that we have, that's actually just one little snapshot in a way of something that we were directly looking for. And this is still on this flatland kind of way of thinking about what we're doing in these experiments, and also what the body is doing in relation to the brain, the environment, and all these ongoing movements that we are. So animals find their way home, they recognize patterns, they make predictions, including humans, of course. And yet, when we observe them and we watch the activity of, rats who've been so helpful for us, for example, in neuroscience, then the only way we can really communicate about what's happening there is through creating these representations, images, or, that we record the cell activity and then we see pictures of it. And all of that is representational, but it's not inside the rat. It's us creating things to understand this ongoing movement. And that gives us a visual, a video, a screen image, whatever. And those are the representations, and those are the communications. And that is a communication. I mean, the screenshot or the recording is meaningless except as communication. And it's important. We're doing that, obviously, in order to better understand this whole process and ourselves. And it's a very real thing, but it's not findable somewhere. So the hippocampus is really central to making more scientific, rigorous sense of what I just said and getting over this assumption and use of language that's binary and that does talk about representations as if they're inside brains rather than as if there are communications towards understanding brains. So for a long time, we actually literally looked for engrams in the brain, stored memories, and that was the hippocampus was like, you know, the sort of heart of where all that came in the 50s, looking for engrams and memories because of HM and so on. And then in the 70s, we started thinking of the same area of the brain as the brain's GPS because John O'Keefe found cells there that fired in relation to what the animal was moving through. So, you know, you got place cells and grid cells and things like this. But this recent research is even showing us that actually these cells don't maintain stable patterns. They're always shifting, remapping, re-anchoring. We don't have like a representation in the brain that corresponds to something outside. Instead, we have this ongoing communication, this process, this something like light coming into a prism and being refracted. You know, that's where this kaleidoscopic comes from, that shifts as the encounter takes place. So all of these cells are shifting, remapping, re-anchoring as the encounter is changing. Just as if light comes into a prism, it's going to change in different ways without any kind of, you know, stopping and starting there. Even though when we study it, we have to look at it that way. So this is where this idea of kaleidoscopic cognition comes in, and it does sound fantastical, maybe psychedelic, but it's actually a really accurate way to begin to envision this, and that it feels strange and even hard is actually part of that. Because what's more like the vision, and again, we're talking a bit in metaphors here, but it's more like something is refracting between and as the encounter and the organism, which includes this whole nervous system. And that is the guiding action. That is the perception in action. And obviously, this is really hard to talk about, but that's what I'm trying to do here. I think we have to find ways to sound strange, be strange, and move towards finding other ways to really understand what's happening here. So we create recordings and photos and videos and representations to understand this. Those are real and communicative, but how could we create more kaleidoscopic ones? How can we begin to use our technology in ways that are more like this process so that we get used to thinking like this instead of creating things that are still stuck in this binary sense of as if we've taken a picture of some kind of whole thing that is mental, that is a memory. So before we get to that, let me just talk about this one question about representation, which I've brought up, but how can the brain have representations and not have them at the same time? How do we hold this paradox without falling into something like computationalism or just total relativism, which is, you know, always the trap here. So that's where this hippocampus paper comes in, which you can find easily and read. And it's arguing that representations are communicative acts, that they're ways we assess and communicate about these unbroken intimacies, not things we like find stored in brains. And I think that's something that's pretty obvious in neuroscience, but we don't talk about it as if it is. And that is a very big obstacle, actually. And of course, there's been tons of representation debates. I mean, we've really wasted, or maybe not wasted, but so much energy and time has gone into getting stuck and going round and round in loops over this idea. You know, even with active inference, I think we all know this idea of talking about models is in the head becomes a trap, and it's time to get out of it. So that's why I'm not in this paper, but in this presentation, presenting this idea of kaleidoscopic or constellatory cognition to kind of just try to pop us out of that way of positioning ourselves in cognitive neuroscience and in the way that we do our models. So we can understand these immediacies like are refracting differently according to the position from which they're measured. And they're not in the thing that's being measured. So weather maps are a really simple, good example. We create a weather map. It represents weather patterns, but the map doesn't contain the weather, even though it's tricky how we confuse those things with what weather is. But, there is no like stop and start to a storm in the sense of you can just pluck it out of all the rest of the ongoing atmosphere or something like that. It's and we need and create these representations of things like that so that we can communicate about them, so that we know, okay, a big hurricane is coming and we need to evacuate or whatever. These are really important representations that we create. But the map is a communicative tool that we use to understand and predict those atmospheric dynamics. The dynamics, of course, they're dynamic. They're ongoing. They're unlocatable. You don't find partly cloudy somewhere. You don't find 70 degrees somewhere. Those are things those are representations, and that's the same thing that we're talking about when we're looking at brains. It's something like 70 degrees when we're talking about a representation in the brain of memory or anything else. So that process that we call weather refracts differently from every position on the planet too. We could think about that, and how, depending on where you are, you're going to see that refraction differently. It's going to be assessed differently, even though, of course, it's real what is being assessed, and it's also ongoing. And also your assessment of it on one particular day from one particular position is going to be different than someone else from another day. And that doesn't mean any of it's less real. And in fact, it'll still probably mean there's a whole lot of regularities that are shared. What you're calling a storm and what they're calling a storm will have a lot of overlap, but it won't be the same thing. And it won't be something that we, have found and then move on from. So neural representations work that way too. When we look at an fMRI image or we record neurons, we're not seeing stored memories or cognitive maps inside the brain. We're creating representations, measurements, assessments that help us communicate about this ongoing central nervous system, bodily, environmental dynamic, which is pretty wonderful actually, and which we really do want to understand. And that's why what we're doing is so important in all these fields. But the hippocampal literature shows us that cognition and navigation, for example, which have kind of been fit into these different sides of a binary of mental and physical, for example, just to kind of caricature it a little bit, we've assumed for a long time that those needed to be reconciled somehow, that they were somehow different things, and how could the same part of the brain be doing them? But recently we've started to understand, okay, they're just like refractions of the same process. At least that's how I'm putting it here. There are different assessments of this embodied waymaking that is happening all the time. And depending what we're looking for or where we're standing or what day it is, it's going to be a little bit different. But also there are going to be regularities that we can, that remain, that help us understand it better if we communicate about it through representations. So when you remember a past event, you're kind of moving through or navigating conceptual space. You could think of it like that. You're using the same mechanisms, right, to move through that sort of space that happens when you're moving through geographical space, but those aren't the same thing. It's just that, there's similar regularities there in terms of what is happening. So I use this word waymaking, which comes from Taoist philosophy, to capture how that cognition and locomotion can be continuous, can be the same process, even though when we're talking about something like remembering our childhood and when we're talking about something like walking to the park, we're talking about different things. And there's no need to try to resolve those. The same way we wouldn't try to resolve wavelengths, that have been refracted from the same light source, or the same, we could think of it somehow as multisensory prisms if we can. But, we can't measure and find that in some absolute sense that there is a memory or there is a little diagram in the head that's going to be found every time we go to the grocery store. So anyway, the hippocampus doesn't store maps. It's operating kaleidoscopically. It's refracting sensory encounter into bodily action. At least that's the kind of wild idea I'm throwing in on this presentation. I haven't tried to put it in a paper, of course, but at least not yet. But I do think we make these maps, these representations, to try to understand what is multi-layered, multidimensional, refracted in our measurements of it, even if in itself it's not. So just, thinking of it like that can help us kind of avoid some of these traps of arguing about pure computationalism versus pure relativism, or telling all the young people that everything's a hallucination, or all these extremes that have sort of taken over and become very exciting in a lot of our fields, but aren't doing justice to the actuality and the complication of this paradoxical happening that is cognition, and that is not only in humans. And of course, we want to avoid relativism too, because these are real accessible regularities, and we do need to communicate about them. And that is a very important thing to be doing. It's science at its best, really. So, what the heck is kaleidoscopic cognition? So, I guess, in all this making way that we're doing, we do make representations of that. Until now, we've made them in these very strict kind of stimulus response, either or mental physical categories. Even if we think those categories aren't somehow actually the process, that some people think everything's mental or everything's physical, all is one. This is pretty normal now for people to say that, but in all the literature, we still talk this way. And so when I talk about kaleidoscopic cognition, I'm really thinking about modeling all this waymaking, all of this ways that the body makes through its encounter, whether you want to think of that through traditionally mental terms or physical terms, whether you want to think of it as making way through conceptual space, virtual space, geographical space, all of those, they can't be collapsed into one another, but they're all way making. And when we're modeling that, we can think of it that way. We can understand it that way. That's the kaleidoscopic cognition. That means imagining that cognitive processes emerge through and as dynamic shifting patterns, rather than this is happening and we look for this fixed representation in the brain. That's the old way, right? And that's the way our language and our papers are structured right now. We could try to understand this through another metaphor, and I'm bringing in this constellatory or kaleidoscopic metaphor, which are just like tubes of mirrors and colored glass and prisms. But if you really think of the ongoing encounter and the sensory body, it is sort of taking in that encounter as if it's light, and it's refracting it into itself in order to continue itself. I know that sounds a bit mystical and wild, but I think we need some of that right now, just as visualization. We still need all the rigor and all the science and all the tests and all the experiments, but we can visualize about how better to do those. We don't have to stay stuck in mental, physical, stimulus response parameters. We can think of the experiment differently. So when light enters a kaleidoscope, it's immediately refracted through like all these prisms and mirrors. And the patterns you see aren't stored anywhere in that device. They just emerge, in this interaction as you turn the whatever the heck you call that thing on a kaleidoscope. You turn the kaleidoscope, I guess, and the patterns change. And that's not stored anywhere. It's just happening. And the light, you need the light coming in, and the whatever, the viewer. I mean, at some point this kind of starts to break down, but I think you get what I'm saying here. Twist the tube, you get entirely new patterns, but all those patterns, if we did the math, could be linked to one another, and we could better understand how they turn into each other and what sort of condition, what sort of light, so to speak, creates what sort of pattern. So the hippocampus, and I would say even the central nervous system, the brain more broadly, works like this. It receives the encounter. I mean, even to say it receives it is kind of wrong, because this is just happening. It's all happening. It's not that the body is sitting there waiting and something comes in and it does something. I mean, to be alive, you're in the encounter, you're encountering. The body is doing this prisming, this kaleidoscopic cognition, and we're trying to understand it by creating representations of it. So those patterns that come in, so to speak, come in to the body aren't like processed and stored, but they are shaping the way the body is going to respond in the future. I think this relates a lot to a lot of these active inference themes that you might be seeing elsewhere in this symposium. But so these patterns aren't processed or stored, they're direct transformations, just like the light is directly transformed when it passes through a prism or the kaleidoscope or whatever that we're going to visualize here. So these sensory regularities of the encounter, the light, so to speak, coming into the body can come from the body too. So, it's also not multi-directional. I mean, it is multi-directional. It's not just like there's an outside and it's coming into the body. You also have the body itself, which we could look at as many kinds of bodies. And all of this is happening at all those levels too. The levels of your cells, for example, or the way that the body and the nervous system are communicating with other parts of the body. So all of those are kaleidoscopes of kaleidoscopes in a way. And it's all happening in this more ecological, direct sense, which is very hard for us to envision and talk about. But I think we're getting to a point where we have to try, and we have technology that allows us to do so. And what happens, if we think of it like this? I think first we understand that multiplicities aren't fixed attributions. They're multiple simultaneous patterns that are operating at once as we measure them. I mean, all of this is just happening, but we are going to be assessing it and able to handle it in that kind of way. So it's true for how we observe and represent the process. The second idea there, I guess, is that these processes aren't structures that we find. And what we call mental content, it's arising from, or it is this ongoing refraction. It's not sort of retrieved data that's been stored somewhere. It's more like water that's being directed in different ways at different levels. Sorry, I've been traveling and have a cold. That's why I'm also not on the video. But I hope this is okay. What else was I going to talk about? I think also the relationality, that meaning is this relationality that's emerging through these shifts of the kaleidoscope, these different prismatics. And refraction matters though, because as part of it, we're part of it. I mean, the way that we notice it, observe it, assess it actually has some major consequence on those very patterns and those ways that we shift the light, so to speak. So I realize all this sounds a bit abstract, but let's look at some more empirical neuroscience. Maybe that's helpful. Some grid cell data. Oh yeah, first I should just mention these different frameworks which are part of that paper, and which I think when we put them all together, we can start thinking about cognition constellations or kaleidoscopic cognition, and from a lot of different angles. And we could even start to try to mathematize it or model it a bit. I didn't really do a big research, but I'm sure there's probably ways that we can model multiple layers of generative models that might be helpful in this way. But anyway, I won't go down that tangent. Active inference, I mean, I think you all probably know this mathematical framework by Carl Friston and many collaborators and colleagues, and this core idea that organisms are minimizing free energy through their action. They're not building these internal models and consulting them, but they are the models, I think, is one way you could think of that. And they're emerging dynamically with or through or as this perception action cycle. So the body, the organism, is constantly engaged in prediction and error correction. And that's kind of what I was trying to say before, that even though this is all happening in the way that you would turn a kaleidoscope or the way light comes through the prism, it's happening at so many different points and places. And all of those in their communication, in the way they communicate with one another, change what's possible for that. That's why this can get really hard to talk about, because we're part of it even as we're studying it. We're always engaged in prediction and error correction, and this happens through our movement and engagement, or not even through, it happens as it. It's not that things are being stored and then we're, looking for those things that are stored. That's only useful when we're trying to communicate about it, to talk about it in that way. So I think active inference obviously helps us with visualizing this, but even puts math on it, and helps us kind of take some steps towards leaping into this different paradigm. And then the radical embodied relation, that's a big part of the paper that's in Nature in the article, which you can read, but a lot of inspiration there from Tony Chimero and everyone who's part of that field. They've been working really hard to try to make that understandable and to show what it's doing in cognitive science for us if we let it. And of course, they've been dealing with this. There's no such thing as a representation idea for a while, which isn't what I'm saying, and actually isn't really what is being said by Chimero, but they've been questioning it in the way that has gotten us to a point where we can start to understand it differently, and where, some people even say, oh yeah, it's obvious, right? Of course there's no representation in the brain, but that was not something that a lot of neuroscientists would have said not too long ago. So I guess the key insight there is that cognition is continuous with navigation in an ecological sense, that these aren't different processes that we're bridging. They do have to be measured differently, just because we measure them towards understanding different things. We're assessing them towards understanding different things. So there's no need to solve them into one another, or say that when we remember our childhood friend, it's the same thing as walking to the park. I mean, there's no need to say that. Instead, we can understand this embodied engagement with the environment, this internal, external, ongoing action that's co-creating the parameters for each part of that. And, I think a lot of you know J.J. Gibson's ecological psychology, and that idea of the brain as the ongoing translator. I always want to say that word, but it's not even quite that, because that makes me think of like Chinese room experiments. But it's not that it's too immediate. It's more like the prism, the light coming in and immediately it's refracted, and it only looks different from the position depending on where your position is. I think that's what a lot of ecological psychology was trying to get at, in a way. So this kaleidoscopic notion of cognition, just to combine all this stuff, well, I'm just going to leave it there. But I would really hope that someone could think about this mathematically. Maybe one of you listening, think about. I mean, this was what I was thinking about. I was thinking about Carl's 2012 paper where he tries to do something like this, or not tries. I mean, he does do something like this, where he's talking about generative models and as like ensembles of other models. And I don't know, maybe someone listening already knows about something that's already been done like this, but how could is it even possible actually to have context sensitive model selection with it still being free energy driven? I mean, with the math, I have no idea, because I'm not so good with this math and all this stuff. But anyway, I was just thinking about it. I guess a big part of the paper that I'm presenting, and what I see as very important in the active inference framework, and why I'm bringing up this wonderful, wild idea of kaleidoscopic cognition, is, as I've already said a few times, just that we're so routed by these ways of making decisions of one versus another, that I think we don't see that they're part of constellations of many more possibilities. And there's a reason we had to go through contrast to get here to where we are now. I don't think those are bad things. I don't think we should stop having distinctions, but I think we should start realizing they're not binary distinctions. I mean, we don't only have mental versus physical, we have emotional, we have virtual, we have geographical. I mean, these are just different ways that the light refracts. And it would be great if we just got used to thinking that way. That's what this kaleidoscopic cognition is. It's thinking through multiplicities instead of binaries. And I think the hippocampus and all the research we've been doing there, where we tried to fit everything into these binary categories for so long, and we're now realizing we just can't, is a very helpful way to rigorously understand this. I think it's very important in philosophy of mind too, that we try to do this rather than building our careers fighting one side or the other of a binary. That's maybe not the most helpful thing to do anymore, which doesn't mean all that stuff was not important. It's actually really important, all of our debates about it. But now we can still have those. We can hold those, and we can explore the space and look at other ways of reframing all of that together. Let's just think about mental and physical for a second. So in neuroscience and philosophy, we talk about as if we moved past those sometimes, like everything is physical or everything is mental or whatever. We just still treat, like thoughts are here and movements are there. And I think what I'm trying to introduce here with this kaleidoscopic cognition idea is that this continuous action perception cycle that we represent as either mental or physical, and can continue to do so, by the way, it's kind of helpful, is itself an ongoing process that's refracting in those different ways. So we hold those together, however we want to define them, and explore them as telling us distinct things about a similar process. In a way, it's what we're already trying to do, because if you're on one side, you say everything is one, and if you're on the other, you say everything is one. But then instead of fighting each other about who is right, let's say, okay, what does your path tell us about this one? And what does my path tell us about this one? So like thinking can be accessed as a form of movement. If we go back to the hippocampus, through conceptual space. That's helpful. And moving can be assessed as a sort of form of thinking through physical space. But thinking about going to the gym is not moving through physical space. And moving through conceptual space is not the same thing as going to the grocery store. And we never need to try to resolve those. That's what we've been trying to do by resolving certain schools of thought, or even just this debate about representations. But we also need to understand that the traditional debate of like, do we perceive the world directly or through internal representations, doesn't even, that either or, that whole setup changes when you start to think of kaleidoscopic cognition, because it opens a space and we can look around a bit and we can engage more directly with reality, and we can see our representations as assessments of that ongoing non-mediated engagement of encountering whatever we're encountering that we might be looking at. Memory versus navigation is a big one for the hippocampus, but I have a whole book coming out about that, so I'll just let you read that. This view that I'm presenting here is just that we're engaging with reality, and we communicate about that with each other, and that is where the representations come in. So dissolving these dichotomies, or not even dissolving them, actually letting them be what they are, and exploring how we can design experiments that don't try to solve one into the other, but rather look at what each tells us about whatever the space is that's holding them. And we might also begin to see other points in this constellation instead of an either or. And maybe those can also tell us something about this process. That's a different way of doing an experiment and of modeling and of thinking. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. And I actually think it's going to mean we have to metricize the experiment itself and really start looking at this in a multidimensional way, where, what we've thought of as the stimulus is itself metricized, and what we've thought of as the response is, and we have many different possibilities for both of those at the same time in one project. So just to get really wild for a minute, just imagine the hippocampus like this. I mean, shifting and refracting at multiple scales at once. So instead of thinking at it, I mean, you can do this with different parts of the brain, but instead of thinking of it as a processor, it's actually not a processor. It's more, refracting light or refracting the ongoing encounter into different possibilities. There's no internal assessment, right? Computation. But we use assessment and computation to understand it when we're communicating with one another about it, and with ourselves about it, by the way. That's an important thing too, because the body communicates with itself in this same way. So it's not that the hippocampus is storing memories as files and maintaining little spatial maps in databases, but it's working more like a prism directing light. So when light hits a prism, it immediately refracts. I mean, it splits into different component wavelengths and it's redirected. I think that's more like what we are actually seeing in these cellular activities that we're studying as a whole, if we think about it. And, the hippocampus is reflecting, representing that in this way that I'm talking about it right now, this sort of metaphorical way. It's not that, the prism doesn't store light. It's just constantly ongoing and refracting it. And there's a wavelength relative to the position from which it's being observed or experienced that's going to be the right wavelength at that moment, I guess, if you're trying to name it. So the HEF, or the hippocampus entorhinal formation, could be understood through something analogous to this. We can imagine it or model it as receiving multiple streams of sensory information, although even that, I mean, that's the way we model it. It's just encountering, the body is encountering the central nervous system. All this is coming in, but we can look at it as seeing and hearing and feeling and tasting and whatever, all these different sensory things that are happening. And we can visualize these as different rays of light sort of hitting this multifaceted prism simultaneously and being refracted. And there's not only one prism, it's, this is happening all over and in many ways. And again, yes, it's a bit strange and a bit metaphorical, but I think you get the point. It's much different than thinking of it as a processor or something being stored like it is on a computer. We need a new metaphor. Anyway, it also, we could think about theta oscillations through this too, because that's even more immediate. The point is just that it's a direct transformation. I think it's helpful now for me to finally talk about actually some neuroscience. And there's recent neuroscience this one, especially the Ping et al. From 2025 in Nature Neuroscience, that shows us that actually grid cells are shifting through multiple reference frames. They're not maintaining a stable pattern, or just like, they're not just this GPS coordinate system that we've kind of come to think of it as. Though I think still seeing it like that can be helpful. And I don't think it's actually saying that's not happening, even though they sort of say that in the paper. But these ongoing refractions are responding to the current organism environment coupling. So you have this shifting of frames. So the hippocampus is literally, if you look at this paper, operating kaleidoscopically. Okay, maybe not literally, but I mean, that's like a really good metaphor for it, because we can see that it's the source of multiple simultaneous refractions, that this system of grid cells is doing this like constant kind of shifting of whatever's coming in. It's remapping and realigning with it on many different levels at once. So that means, shifting based on action and the regularities of whatever's being encountered in real time. And the hippocampus helps us understand this. So instead of just thinking like when we have these, when we have this awareness of our mind, or we hear these words in our head, that's one kind of cognition, or maybe the only kind of cognition. And then moving through a city is not a cognition, it's just moving through the city. Actually, no, I mean, that's where this waymaking comes. Like everything that the body is encountering, it's refracting through itself in this way as cognition. That is cognition. It's making way. It's making way with the encounter. And so we have to start thinking of cognition as a more constellatory thing. It's not that there's physical against mental, it's that all of those words are different ways we're understanding how this bodily organism is making its way. That doesn't mean everything is cognition, but it does mean that the body is cognitive at any time that it's trying to make its way through anything. It's a pretty simple way of thinking about cognition, and yet you can't collapse different kinds of movement into one another. So that's where it matters very much what you're studying. You have to really metricize the landscape, actually. If you're going to be studying how the body's making its way through an emotional landscape, you need to know what that means. What is an emotional landscape? How do you metricize that? Because we have to represent that externally, not assume that we're looking for it in the brain. This is a different way of thinking about it. Same with virtual landscapes, same with geographical landscapes, whatever you want to call them. The point is that if you're going to call it something, you have to be able to say what the regularities are that you're studying, and then look at how that relates to whatever the data is that you're getting from the experiment. So the body, through the central nervous system, or as the central nervous system, is this encountering into bodily action. And it's not like a two-step process. Like we perceive, then we act, and there's a transformation going on, at some point too. Like this is all happening all the time at once. When we study it, we break it down. But right now we're studying it and breaking it down and looking for it in the body somehow. And instead we need to realize actually we're representing it. That's what we're doing. We're communicating about it. And we need to be able to represent it and compare it at different levels, more like a kaleidoscope. We need that kind of ability to change things just a little bit and see very different patterns with the same input, the same light, so to speak. I really think we can model this. We can create neural recordings or computational models or linguistic descriptions even that really help us understand and communicate about these processes in ways that aren't stuck and routed in these binary terms and these either or frameworks that we all still assume we can break out of now, but it will take being a little bit crazy and and thinking a little bit differently about how to do experiments, which doesn't mean giving up any of the rigor of it. It just means realizing that those representations, those assessments, those communications are even more important than we thought. And all the data we've already collected is probably able to tell us even more than we thought if we can position it to itself in a different way. So we can think of cognitions as constellations when we're modeling them, interconnected patterns that emerge through this refraction. So the way we move to the grocery store and the way we move through a conceptual space on a computer program or a virtual space will definitely have some patterns shared the same way that each turn of the kaleidoscope does. How do we look at that relation without trying to solve them into each other? That's really the point. So this is looking more deeply into this empirical paper. Just want to give you a little more information about it. So they actually recorded grid cells in the entorhinal cortex. The hippocampal entorhinal formation is really what I'm talking about here when I say hippocampus. But so they recorded grid cells in this area, actually in the entorhinal cortex, I think, when the animals were performing a path integration task. And that just means like dead reckoning or moving, like keeping track of your position by monitoring your own movement. So when they did that, they found that there was no stable grid patterns during this path integration, that the grid cells were functioning. They were not functioning actually as like some kind of stored coordinate system. They were, there's not like this internal metric that is just being pulled out for every place. However, there is a pattern, but it's shifting continuously throughout the task. So again, I really think the way you can understand this is the kaleidoscope. There are patterns there, right? But it's never the same pattern with each turn. And whatever light is coming in is also going to mean that the pattern is different. And there's a constant kind of remapping and realigning that's going on. So the patterns shift continuously of the grid cells throughout the task. And that doesn't mean that, like, from our position of assessment, we wouldn't find metrics. But what it does mean is that those metrics will look different depending on the refraction from that position of assessment, because this whole cellular network is framing based on what is encountering. So although this paper sort of presents it as contrasting with the navigational research and this GPS metaphor, I think it's actually widening the landscape. Like, it's including that metaphor, and it's also including a lot of the memory research so that we can sort of explore the space that's holding them. But that's my opinion. But they did notice what they call re-anchoring through translation. And that's an important term, this re-anchoring through translation. So they even use that word translation. It's interesting. But so the grid cells like shift between reference frames within single trials. So one moment they're coding the position relative to the room frame, let's say, and then they're shifting to a coding position relative to like some sort of salient object that we need to use, like a hammer or like a doorknob or whatever. And then they're shifting to another room frame. And then, so this is this refraction that I'm talking about. And we have to remember that as scientists, we're choosing what to look at and study. So that's part of this representing that we're doing to try to, this communicating about what's happening. But the cells themselves seem to be, working more at an ecological level, but also able to shift and realign. So despite these pattern changes, this internal structure is preserved, like this manifold that we use to describe grid cells organization. It's intact, but it's not like random noise. It's structured shifting. So that's a big point, which I don't even understand fully yet. But I'm trying to explain it here through this idea of the kaleidoscope, that or this idea of holding paradox. There is something there that is structured, and there is a constant changing of that structure, like in a kaleidoscope. Like that's the kaleidoscopic function that I'm thinking of here. This multiple simultaneous reference frames, constantly shifting, maintaining a relational structure with the patterns that continually change. That's hard to hold that. That's the holding the paradox right there. And the hippocampus is doing it, and probably the whole body is doing it. And how can we begin to create representations? And by that, I mean our communicative measurements and our experiments and so forth, that start from there, that think that way, holding the paradox like that. That's what I'm trying to get at here, really, in all of this. And I think that's helpful. And I think the hippocampal entorhinal system is a really wonderful, beautiful, scientifically validating way to understand this. So we can engage in modeling without having models, or that we are representing without having representations. That's the holding paradox of all of this, I guess. This dynamic process replacing the static conception of what we're doing, and the brain's evaluating, organism environment relations, but this evaluation isn't separate from the action, even if we have to represent it that way to communicate about it. So creating representations, whether computational models or math or whatever, to help us communicate about these. And what I don't know the math well enough to say how one might pop this idea into something like a constellation, but I do think of this geometric hyperscanning idea that some people in the active inference community have started to talk about, this topological way of considering this. I think this might be one possibility for how we might think about kaleidoscopic cognition through active inference. And yeah, I think I've already talked long enough and I don't have much of a voice left, but I was thinking a lot about generative models and how we can think of the model as the ongoing coupling. So how can this become understood as constellatory? Free energy minimization is like driving, the perception and action. When you encounter something, when light patterns hit, there's an immediate refraction through your organism environment history. And this isn't processing or computation, it's more like the shifting of light through the prism or this kaleidoscopic turn. How can we create kaleidoscopic generative models? How can we create kaleidoscopic generative models? I think that's really the only question that needs to be said from this slide. How do we begin to let the models communicate in the way a kaleidoscope turns? I mean, that's kind of a crazy question, but something like that. That's kind of what I want to ask, what I want to see if it's possible. The wild, crazy question. So, some implications for neuroscience if we really take all this seriously, or if we don't take it seriously, even better. It would mean rethinking what neural function is fundamentally, that like cognitions are the ways the body makes through whatever it encounters. So, when we're recording from neurons, when we're looking for patterns in as cognitions, they're not to be found, but they are to be better communicated about as multiplicities, as possibilities. We're not even in a spectrum, in a constellation of spectrums. And memories are patterns of refraction, perhaps we could think about it like that sort of reconstitute when refracted. This is happening again in many different directions and dimensions, not just in some kind of linear way that's coming in from the outside, but you communicate with yourself in this way too, and you refract and shine the light through the prism. Yeah, there's all kind of things we could think about with theta oscillations, but why go there now? Also, just understanding that bodily is the sensory cohesion that can be understood as the refraction patterns, that we don't separate all these things together except to study them and communicate about them, which is a very important exception. So long as we understand that's what we're doing. And, this gives us an understanding of what body we're assessing and with our measurements and where the boundaries of the agent might be, because we have to set them. Because we start to understand all this is just part of the experiment of the way we're representing so as to communicate. And you can never actually represent the way making because we're part of it.